Hey, everybody, welcome to STRonomics, or as Kenny likes to call it, STRonomics. Welcome back. We got a great episode for you today. We're going to talk about when you should and when you should not buy. Kenny Bedwell from STR Insights, lead us off.
Yes, I had a person email me the other day, and they were curious about, hey, where in Buffalo, New York, should I purchase a property? So the number one question I asked them was, well, what's your budget? Naturally, right? And they said $60,000, and I was like, well, I
60
mean,
grand in cash for a down payment or 60 grand like
yeah,
total purchase price?
yeah. So it was like, so $60,000 for a down payment, which in Buffalo that's kind of doable depending
So
on
that
the
was for
area.
the down payment.
Well, I'll get to that in a second. It
Okay,
was
you're
not
telling the
just for the
story.
down
Sorry.
payment; that was everything.
Okay.
But they were thinking like they weren't thinking about all the other costs associated with purchasing a short-term rental. Beyond just the down payment, like the rehab, any sort of update, the furnishings, things like
Right.
that. And we got talking about, okay, you've got $60,000. Really, you're going to want to hold out, especially if you're going to buy a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom, probably about 20,000 to 30,000 of that. It's got to go to furnishings and maybe some updates in the property, because there is no property in Buffalo that's perfectly updated, that's ready to go for a short-term rental in the right areas at that low of a price point. So, like that, there's just no wiggle room there.
Right.
And so like you're kind of forcing something that really isn't there and could put you in a
And
financial
what price
bind.
point are you talking about? You're popping like max 275, 285, right?
Yeah, max that. Yeah. Well, I mean, there are places
Unless
that
they're
are
going to
like,
do a 5% down or something along
yeah,
those
well,
lines.
there are places that are like $200,000, but once again, they're a dump, and you're going to have to dump. Like it
You
needs,
probably need that full 60 to renovate, right? And update.
if not more. So I mean, it's kind of one of those things like, and then if you're in the right areas, that's another thing too. I was saying is like, look, sure, you can short-term rental in a lot of areas of Buffalo, but you don't want a short-term rental in a lot of areas of Buffalo. There's only certain neighborhoods that are really doing well. And so you need to identify what those neighborhoods are. And once you do, the prices of the homes all of a sudden go from that, 200 range up to like 300-400 range.
Right. And but
So
your story, just so everybody listening, is not just about, it has nothing to do with Buffalo. It has
no, it
everything to
doesn't.
do with why this person should or should not purchase at this given point.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot of people out there who don't understand the true costs associated with getting into the short-term rental game to purchase a property. Now that the great part about this industry is you don't have to necessarily purchase to get started in short-term rentals. So what else can we do, Bill?
I mean, you can co-host, you could house hack. I mean, there's a lot of things that you could do, but I think co-hosting is the easiest path to be able to go down. I think this is an interesting story that you're sharing because it used to be, I think it was that Vegas flipping show, like Flipping Vegas or something. And they would have the clock, or it might have been the early days of Flip or Flop, on HGTV or something. And the one thing I do like about Flip or Flop is Tarek always would talk about the carry costs because they were always using hard money. Even
Mm,
it seemed like at the end when they were uber wealthy, they weren't using their own money; they were still using hard money. And he would talk. This is costing us $4,000 a month, $5,000 a month, and I think a lot of people like that person's not even considering how long it's going to take them to prep the property post close and
yep.
what that carry cost is going to be. And that's something like I love my wife dearly, and we've done this a lot, but she seems to forget that. When we go in and it takes a month to do a property, like we're renovating bathrooms in Montana right now. And, I've got a $5,200 a month payment there. So
Mm,
every month that goes on to my P&L as an expense, $5,200, for principal and interest. I've got probably 400, 420, in liability insurance, all those things. I've got to heat the place. I'm spending money on propane and electricity. Those are things that people don't think about. So I'm going to jump in real quick and go right back to you. If you don't know how to factor those things in, you're not ready to buy. You should
right.
not be buying.
Yeah, I mean that's I started laying out all the biggest thing for me is a carrying cost. I said, well, look, let's say you find a property, and this was a couple months ago. So I said you're going to close on it in March. You're probably not going to have any bookings, if any at all, because it's the slow season. and you won't have any until at least May or June. Are you ready to hold those costs, carry those costs, like you're saying, until May or June, where it could really start paying the bills? And so, that's one of the things that like a lot of people aren't thinking about is, hey, look, I've got, not only do I have to furnish a place, but the time it takes, that's just going to sit there, and, you're not going to make, you're not making any money. So that's got to be part of the budget, when you sit down. So I guess let's go into that. So Bill, let me ask you, when you're going to before you purchase a property, how do you create your budget? So like, it's like, well, I can afford a $500,000 property or $800,000 property. How much cash should I have to budget for that purchase for a short-term rental?
So that leads to a much deeper question. And this is where, knowing and being known, right? When you join the mastermind, that's like the number one thing. You got to peel off the Band-Aid. We got to be honest. A lot of it has to do with their personal financials. We talk about this in our Super Team Accelerator program a lot, right? To where it's not just somebody saying I can afford it, or I have $100,000 in cash to put 20% down. It's like, well, what do you have behind that?
Right.
How secure are your financials? How much cash on hand do you have? How secure is your job or your business? What's your personal cash flow? Kind of going through almost like a Fannie and Freddie or a loan officer at a commercial bank. What's your DTI? Here, what happens if you buy this $500,000 property, you put $100,000 down, and to your point, it doesn't cash flow. How long can you sustain that cash flow? So then you go into the budget side, right? So for what I do, I don't think is applicable really for this conversation, but I think what I coach and what I see people doing is way more applicable. And a lot of people say they have $100,000 and they can afford, like you said, that $500,000 property, but they might have a household income of $150,000. So I also want them to mitigate the risk and the job security. You and I know people in the tech sector that have been made really good money, $200,000, $300,000, $500,000 salaries a year, and they've been laid off, in the last 6 months. And there's more big layoffs coming. So you got to look at that risk analysis as well. And I don't think there's any standardized formula, from the thousands of people that I've coached, and I know you've gotten into this in the last 6 to 9 months too. Everybody's situation's different. My situations and how I prep for my acquisition is going to be completely different than yours. Just look at how we talk about, your potential move that you're looking to do personally, right? That is so different than if I up and moved my family today versus that. Use Patrick Swintek as an example, a single mid-20s, kid in California. The flexibility difference between you and me as husbands, fathers, entrepreneurs, and what he's doing as a single male is completely different. So that's where I think that the knowing and being known, but I think you have to build out the pro forma. You've got to have the full gamut of all the expenses. You need to forecast at least that seasonality that you talked about. I can't tell you how many people I've talked about that closed on properties late July, late summer at the beach, and they got annihilated with, no booking, very few bookings in November, December, and, nada, scapoots, zero, in January and February. And they're like, hey, I'm going to run out of money. Well, I feel really bad for you, but you didn't know what the fuck you were doing, right? You didn't plan appropriately. And that's kind of like my biggest mission outside of teaching people how to make more money is like, don't make those mistakes. So I love you. Kenny came up with the topic of this. I love this because there's a lot of reasons that people shouldn't buy, but that's the number one is it goes back to John Hodge, right? The bank whisperer. Don't tell me a story. Yeah. Show me the pro forma and the financials, and that should dictate all of our decision-making process. But we all, Kenny, you've done it. I've done it. We all do it. We try to convince ourselves that this is a good deal. And so I think that's another reason. If you have to convince yourself, if you and I are looking at this screen and we're looking in the camera, if we have to look in the mirror and tell ourselves how great this deal is, it's probably not that great of a deal. So I think that self-talk is another reason not to buy. But I think not having the financial wherewithal. So for me, I kind of treat it like most people would that probably are less financially stable than myself. But I go and I'm over budget in Montana already, and I'm going there tomorrow, and I'm probably going to add more things to it. but I can afford it. And I do factor in the budget. We started with a $45,000 budget. It's going to be 80 to 90. We're going to go way over. But that's because it's the lifestyle property for us, right? I will never get a return on the sauna or the hot tub in this location. I'm not going to get a return on upgrading. I could probably get a return maybe on the sauna and the hot tub. I'm not going to get an upgrade on or return on the bathrooms. The $40,000 I'm putting in the bathrooms because that's what we want for our retirement home is not really a financially driven decision, right? But I'm still factoring that into the budget. Bree and I still look at the budget. Every time she places an order, it goes onto a Google sheet that calculates what our initial budget was by category, right? And then we show where we're going over budget in the category. And we have this, we call it the BBWT. Literally, that's what it's Bill Bria want this. Right? It's the want category versus the thing that's necessary. So I do think that the underestimation of what it costs to close on a property, to get it set up, to get it live, people don't factor in travel costs, whether it's fuel costs to drive there or the food that you got to stop at Bucky. I stopped at Bucky's twice yesterday going down to my lake house. I had to fill up with gas twice. It cost me about $120 in gas to get there and back yesterday just to have fiber installed, right? I stopped and I had lunch twice, so it probably cost me, $170. Most people don't factor that in. You do that 3 or 4 times in a 30-day setup, that's significant. Then you factor in a $5,000 a month carry cost. And you always don't factor in small things like if you go in and if you bought in an LLC and you really want to keep that anonymity and you want to get power, they consider you a business. So you typically have to put a $300, $400, $500 deposit down, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot with water, you have to do that as well because they consider you commercial. Those are things that people don't factor in on the financial side on the front end.
Right. So what would you, just for people listening, how much should they set aside, not for the furnishings, not for the closing costs, but like a percentage of their budget? How much do you think that they should set aside just in case? Like
I wouldn't say it's a percentage of their budget. I think they have to have not, if you're not within like 45 to 60 days of going into a guaranteed peak season, like you'll have at a beach market, right? I think you need to have 6 months of runway. And I look at people that invested into the Beach Mountain market, the Sugar Mountain, that whole Banner Elk Western. We had a horrible winter because we had no snow. I don't believe it was because of lack of demand. Same thing in Snowshoe, way down. Talk to Manish, and they're down there. So you can't factor those things in. What happens if we go in June, we have an early hurricane, and people get wiped out, or their property's just damaged, and it takes 2 months to get repaired? You miss the entire season. I've been through a hurricane in Gulf Shores. I just went through a almost virtually no snow season in Western North Carolina. Yes. I've lived through these things and they suck. I grew up in California where an earthquake could completely disrupt traffic from Los Angeles to Northern California and trucking and produce and all these things that we don't consider. The savvy investor considers all of those things. So what I will tell you, all I can do is tell you my personal approach. I do keep 6 months of budget, and I add that on top. So if I had a $45,000 budget for Montana, and I know that my bare minimum carry costs are going to be about $6,900, then I round that up to $7,000, and then I multiply that times 6. There's literally a checking account, and for those of you that are coming to the STR Wealth Conference, you'll see it when the keynote Michael is, or you would have seen it, a couple of days ago when Michael's talking about it's in an account. Right? It's not just in my head, it's actually in an account. And even though I have other means to be able to pay that, there's this psychological factor that happens to know that, hey, here's my budget for my design and rehab and furnish. Here's my operating budget. And then here is my contingency, bank accounts to where they're all separated. And I've done that for years in the way that I've separated my financials, that I learned from somebody that was better at that than I am. Because when I was younger, like when I was your age, I was still literally operating entire businesses out of one checking account. And that's what most people do in this business. And you just don't have a real grasp of the financial health of your business that way.
Yeah, I really like that. One of the things too that a lot of people don't think about is the fact that when you get started, bookings are a little bit slower. You have to build those reviews and ratings up. Obviously, like we have our techniques to get quickly out the door, get those 3 reviews and 5-star reviews. So you immediately, like, they start showing the star status and you start getting bookings, but you're competing, the numbers I sent you, Bill. I think, this will come out after the conference, but like just right after the conference, I imagine, but 72% new short-term rentals year over year. 72%. That is a massive increase. But when you add a new short-term rental, you're competing against all the other ones in your market that have been there for year plus.
Yeah.
So, and they have all these reviews, they have all these ratings already. They're already well established. Like people in my market in Buffalo, I have a property that has almost over 300 reviews. Okay. It's got a 4.89, it's up at the top, and it rarely drops in ranking just because of how many reviews I have. And I'm trying, exactly. It's very stable. And I rarely have to put any effort into marketing because of the amount of time compared to everybody else that's on there that just jumped into the game. And so when you're new, you're going to have to compete. You're going to have to put in a little more effort than just throwing it up there. And so and the problem, what a lot of people do is they'll try to use, for example, my property as a comparable. And they'll say, well, I have the same type of property, it's going to look the same. It should be in the same neighborhood, and I should expect the same type of revenue. But in actuality, it's going to take you some time to build up to that revenue, especially in the first year. So and this is a newer concept for a lot of folks. A lot of people listening, they might have already had short-term rentals and they've never had to think like this. But because of such an increase in supply, we're having to change our approach and how we model and project our revenue as well. And that will impact your budget and how much you should save in order to get started with any short-term rental.
Right. I those are all great points. And one other reason I think people shouldn't buy that I want to bring up, I wish Ryan Bakey was here, is you don't buy just for tax purposes. Right. And I think a lot of people do that, especially the professionals that have high W-2 incomes. They're buying. But what happens is if you compromise on that front end, there's no question. We all make our money on the front end. I can't take a turd of a property and use, I believe I'm the absolute number one marketing guy in this industry. I can't take a turd and turn a $20,000 a year grossing property into 100. It's like virtually impossible unless it's rehabbed, redesigned, upgraded, whatever. I can, outperform AirDNA and STR Insights and all that stuff. But if somebody makes a bad decision on the front end, you're not going to be able to outmarket it. You're not going to be able to rank it high enough to do all these things. And I think a lot of people are doing this and have done this over the last 2 years, specifically during COVID, because, the cost segregation became such a huge thing that was typically not really leveraged a whole lot in this space and, in LTR and that. And there's the loophole, the STR loophole. It had been done a lot in commercial investments, but I think a lot of people are buying below average properties with very low, I'll just use the term cap rates, even though we don't use that very much, just to get the cost segregation benefit. And as Ryan says, now you're going to end up with some, dud properties that might break even if things get even worse, might lose money. And so you're taking this negative cash flow asset that's bleeding your cash dry for that one-time cost segregation benefit. And don't send emails. I get we can dispersed over 5 years, but the majority of it happens in year one for most people. So I think that's a really bad reason for people to invest and to buy.
Right. And I'll just say this too, because the title is When You Should or Shouldn't Purchase. If you're not planning on holding the price, if you're thinking of a cost,
we might have to change that, Kenny, to why you shouldn't purchase, because we haven't said
there you go. I know we're scaring everybody away. Maybe we should talk about when you should purchase. But just kind of going on to that too, there aren't a lot of people talking and I assume they're not thinking about it, but I don't really hear a lot of people talking about I'm planning to hold this property for 10 plus years. It's not even something that's brought up. They might subconsciously think that they're going to be doing that, but there's no real plan, long-term plan for these properties. And someone, purchasing in a particular market, they're not thinking about that.
That
like,
has to be part of that decision-making process.
It does. It does. I would even say, like, when I bought my property last year in Watkins Glen, I wasn't thinking about, hey, I might move out of this state into another state. Sure, I can still run this property, but do I still want this property that's, 2 hours or an hour and a half from the biggest airport, near there? Like, so if I go there, I'm going to have to fly there, then rent a car and drive there. And, like, you know what I mean? And, like, how often do I want to go to Watkins Glen per year to check on that property?
Right.
It's like things like that. Like, but I know, like, my plan on that property is a little bit shorter term thinking, but I wasn't thinking about, 10 plus years. And if I really wanted to have it for that long when I got it.
So I think that's part of building out that long-term strategy, right?
Yeah.
And, that's like lesson number 1 in our accelerator program. And that's why we go over that first, is to have that long-term strategy is, and so there's a big difference. If you're gonna buy and potentially not hold for at least 5 years, and that's kind of what I call the Mendoza line, that's the baseline, and you do a cost seg, you're gonna have recapture of that accelerated depreciation when you sell. If you do a 1031, that's gonna affect it as well. So I think that that's part of when you're building out your long-term investment plan that should tie into your other professional endeavors that you have, tie into your family life and defining your retirement, how you invest. And it doesn't have to be buy and hold for 10 years plus for your entire portfolio, but every property that you purchase, you need to have this mental timeline, with it on what you intend to do with it. And I'll never forget, if you remember Jim Folger in our mastermind, when I was buying and selling a lot in 2021 in Gulf Shores. And I remember he called me, Bill, what are you doing? You're selling these properties. You've only owned it for 90 days. Are you okay? Are you losing money? People are talking in the mastermind. I'm like, dude, that's part of the strategy. When the market was investing at 3 to 5% a week, I wanted to buy and sell. It's the only time I've done it in my life, but the conditions were right. So that was the time to buy, right? I can't do that today, or I could, but I wouldn't. I think it's too risky to flip today. But a reason to buy, I do believe, if you are financially secure, if you could absorb, if you are a 10-year hold and you can go and break even or potentially even lose 5% or only make 5 or 10%, and you can find a smoking deal in a great long-term market, it's a great time to buy.
Yeah. Yeah. And sellers are more and more motivated today than they were a year ago, and so you can get some decent deals and not have to put as much cash down. You can wrap in the cost of the furnishings or, maybe updates into the property, into the purchase price, rather than just, having to have that down payment.
It's funny you bring that up. I was just talking with John Hodge about that yesterday. When I purchased in Montana, how long has it been? Maybe 3 weeks ago. I got $25,000 below list, which is, that's not a big deal, but it was $1 million property. But I also got all the furnishings, which was probably about $30,000 in furnishings, and I got $5,000 towards closing costs. I said, he's like, when's the last time you've got something like that? I said, I can't remember having something like that since like 2018. Even before COVID, 2019, the market was still strong. And, I think the one property I bought in 2019, I think I paid full price for, right? So, and you see a lot of the like the 2-1 buy downs and the opportunities. I do believe if you're financially in a position to buy, now is a great time to buy.
Yeah. There's just more, like, you can get a little more creative, I think.
Agreed.
In terms of your offer.
We have it's a buyer's market. We have leverage, right?
Exactly.
Awesome. So. Great job, Kenny, as always, my friend. Thank you guys for joining us on STRonomics. We love STRonomics, STRonomics. It's brought to you by Build Short-Term Rental Wealth and STR Insights. Right there, Kenny Bedwell, the #1 data guy in our entire industry. We'll see you guys next week.